This is FRM Part 2, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on Banking Conduct and Culture. This chapter is part of a series of chapters on operational risk with an emphasis on behavior and culture. So of course there's going to be some overlap in topics that we've discussed before, but there are a few added value items inside of this chapter that are worth noting and, of course, worth knowing for examination purposes. As you look at the learning objectives, some of these might sound familiar from previous chapters. Look at that second one, explain methods to improve corporate culture. That has been a theme throughout these first several chapters in this book. And then, of course, we'll have to summarize national regulators. We always have to talk about regulators and their input into the corporate structure and the decision-making process. And then we'll go ahead and have a slide on best practices. Let's go ahead and start discussing about this topic of company culture. And we've seen this definition in some previous chapters, but it probably bears repeating. System of shared beliefs and values and behaviors that shape conduct. I like that part of the definition. And then I like the positive reputation for banks. When I think of culture in an organization, I can't help but think about one of my favorite sports. And this is going to be one of my sports analogies that translate back into the operation of financial industries. You know, I've been a golfer my whole life, but I've never done it at any kind of competitive level. However, one of my sons is a pretty competitive golfer. Ever since he was just a little boy. And when you go and show up at these junior golf tournaments or the tournaments that he plays in now, there is a culture. And the culture is based on the simple fact that everybody playing and everybody spectating expects the golfers to play by the rules of golf, which have been established by really, really smart men and women for a really long time period. And here's my point about the culture. You can do a search and you can find out that there are a few golfers over the years who have been accused of, bending the rules of golf. Maybe, can I even use the C word? Maybe they cheated in the rules of golf. And this is pretty much how they're remembered. And so one of the great lessons I've taught my son is that, look, I don't care if you shoot 150, count your scores, just do it honestly. This is the whole idea of integrity. And so I can't help but think that this golfing culture that promotes and it encourages and punishes individuals for violating the culture of honesty and the mathematics of adding your scores and then the mathematics of playing by the rules can't be applied to financial institutions. I mean, look at this. Company culture has a strong influence on employee behavior. The culture of honesty in golf influences every golfer that's competing from the junior level all the way up to the professional tours. Look, both written and unwritten rules. This is extremely important in golf, although golf has written rules, but there are unwritten rules as well. And this applies to financial institutions as well. If you have a strong leadership in the board of directors and those banking executives, then that leadership will filter down to all of the golfers throughout the organization, of course. Now, some important points that the introduction of this chapter discusses are shown in those two block points there at the bottom. All right. Culture also comprises a bank's values and ethics. So whatever the source of those values and ethics are, is going to be the idea of bringing this corporate culture, bringing this company culture together so that everybody inside of the organization can can act as a team. Now, I've used this example in the past, and maybe you guys remember this. You think about it, if we're a bank, and you and I are the bank representatives inside of this physical location, and we have two clients come into the bank. One of the clients has money and wants to invest it. Another client needs money and wants to borrow it. And so here's the idea. We need to have a culture that enables us to make the most efficient and effective decisions for those particular clients. Let's take an extreme example. Let's suppose the one client comes in and says, I would like to borrow $1 million because I'm convinced that this particular horse is going to win the Kentucky Derby, and I want to bet $1 million on this race. The person that comes in, the client that comes in that has $1 million says, look, I have $1 million. I want to use it as maybe collateral or maybe a margin account. And I want to take the long or the short position in a Kentucky Derby futures contract. All right, so we need to take a deep breath. Remember, we're agents of this financial institution. We need to think back, all right, what does the board of directors say about horse racing? And maybe they don't say anything about horse racing, but clearly the board will say something about risk management principles. Do we want to take this amount of risk, right? Horse racing, who knows how much risk there is? Do I want to go that far out? And so it might be that it's our job, it's our responsibility, it's being good stewards of the bondholders and the shareholders' capital on the right-hand side of the bank's balance sheet, that we can take these two clients and we can mold them into something that is better for them and better for us. Clearly, leveraging to play a horse race is probably not consistent with the risk-return objectives outlined by the board of directors. All right, but do you see my point? And my point leads right into the second block point at the bottom. Each firm has its own unique culture. And so it's probably true that most financial institutions are not going to get involved in gambling and horse racing betting, right? Probably not. But we have these clients, they're not our only two clients, and they're come one right after the other, and we need to decide, do we have low risk clients or we have high risk clients? And so this company culture is going to allow us to make these decisions. Okay, so let's swing back up at the top. A system of shared beliefs and values and behaviors that shape conduct. All right, so this is extremely important. What are we trying to do? Goal of any business is to maximize the value to the owners of the business, right? And so we have these clients come in. It's our job then to provide a scenario under which both of those two individuals can walk out of the bank with smiles on their faces. Here's an interesting figure that relates inputs versus outputs. And so let's just start at the bottom left down here, bank history. I'm going to go back to my golf example. Those of you who are golfers probably know that golfing as a sport, wasn't invented 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, it was developed over, literally hundreds of years. Most people attribute this back to the shepherds, somewhere in Europe, but it could have been in almost any part of the country because shepherds had a stick and they had rocks, and so they probably just hit those rocks around. And so over, literally thousands of years. There's evidence that shepherds were existing, back, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And so over time, there was a culture of rules. And then there was, a sidelight to this, a culture of gambling. You can see two shepherds out there saying, I bet I can hit this rock farther than you can. And so they had to play by rules. So this golfing culture of honesty has evolved for a really, really long time. And so this is important to view in terms of a bank's history. Now, of course, in the financial institution industry, you've got lots of mergers and lots of acquisitions. So it's not like every bank out there can go back to the time of the Roman Empire. But clearly there is a bank history that has individuals and teams of individuals, whether they started inside of this particular bank or came from other banks. So the bank history is extremely important. The board of directors then is charged with the responsibility of consuming this bank history and then forming it to some strategic plan for a layout of the future. And so look where culture fits in there: conduct and behavior, values and ethics. And again, let me emphasize, it doesn't really matter where those values and ethics come from, as long as they are based on the notion that all clients are created equal, all clients should be treated fairly and with respect, and all clients should be informed of the risk and return opportunities that are available for their specific needs. And so education of the client and education of the financial managers, of course, is all part of that culture. So you take those inputs and then you throw them over into outputs. And what does this mean? So here's our two clients walking into our bank. Reputation and trust, value and ethics. So these two clients come in and they want to invest somewhere in the Kentucky Derby, and they walk out, and maybe instead of $1 million investing in the Kentucky Derby, maybe we get them down to $10,000 in the Kentucky Derby, and then we take the rest of that and we form some well-diversified portfolio that fits their needs and their particular aspirations for future outcomes. All right, so if you think about that, having those two clients leave our bank with smiles on their faces, then that has to translate into some acceptable, preferred, desired financial performance that will be illustrated, and evidence will be shown in the financial statements. Now, here's a great question. Why are we even having this conversation? Now, of course, hopefully the last few minutes of this conversation will indicate that this is really important. But here are some examples. High-profile public scandals. I do know a little bit about some of these, and I'm guessing you guys do as well, so I won't comment on them too much. But I will go over to the J.P. Morgan, the London whale. I think that guy's name was Bruno. He was just trading credit derivatives, and it was almost like he was working in a closet and nobody even knew the closet was there. And then somebody opened the closet and looked at him in there and then closed the closet door. And then sooner or later somebody opened it, and then all those losses came out. And so if you look at these examples, I mean, these are examples of illegal behavior, criminal behavior, unethical behavior, immoral behavior, something like this. And they are, these scandals can be seen in almost each part of the balance sheet for a financial institution. Now, trying to address this concept of why is conduct and culture so important, there was a survey done in which clients out there were asked the question, how much do you trust in each of these different kinds of sectors? And so if you look at this is 2015 out to 2019, technology 74 to 78. So, there's a trend, and look over in the right column, those trends are pluses. But the interesting part of this table is that financial services starts out at the bottom and ends up at the bottom. And so it's the responsibility of the individuals, which is you and me, inside of the financial services industry to move that barometer from being at the bottom, all the way up to the top. I mean, seriously, think about it. Financial services to clients and potential clients and consumers of the services inside of these industries. Are we really that far behind energy and entertainment? Sure, seems like it. Boy, I'd be fascinated. Don't you think it would be fascinating to see what the 2020 results would be after the COVID-19? Now, of course, one of the learning objectives has to be, all right, so we know that conduct and culture are important. So the question then becomes, all right, how do we make sure that we get there? So what measures what measures have banks taken to improve in these areas? And this is where there'll be some overlap. And so I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of these. I mean, look at that first one, board of directors. So heighten engagement by the board, and don't forget the senior leadership. Communication and training programs, of course. Now remember, we've got this umbrella, and then we have these different silos or business lines. And so you've got to train and communicate inside each silo, and then cross-siloing. I'm pretty sure siloing is not a word. We've also had some good conversations about remuneration and compensation. Of course, if you want your employees to behave in a certain way, then it makes sense to provide them with some incentives. And so, you're going to say something like, you know what, I want you to do this and this and this when a client comes into the office. And if you do this and this and this and the outcome is positive, well, then I'll pay you a bonus or something like that. And then let's skip down to the bottom one just pretty quickly. Of course, you guys know this better than I do, that, financial services industry, it's innovating and it's engineering all the time. And so one financial institution that has a history of mortgage-backed securities may find itself leaping pretty quickly over to credit derivatives. All right. So new product approval, and then the appropriate governance structures in accord with that new product approval, and then everything with pricing and risk management. And so those four block points, we have had a conversation with those before, but look at the fourth one there. And this is one of the important components of this particular chapter, and it probably should be a point of emphasis on the exam. So how about not just a first line of defense, but a second and a third line of defense? Now, I have a slide a little bit later on that will explain these in more detail, but historically, what's happened is that most financial institutions have a first line of defense. So I want you to think about, a football game, and the defense. There are 11 people on the defensive line of scrimmage, and so there's usually 3 or 4 or 5 defensive linemen. That's the first line of defense. And then there's usually 2 or 3 or 4 linebackers. There's the second line of defense. And then there are 3 or 4 secondary people in the back. They're called secondary, even though it probably was the third line of defense. Secondary because if the people up front don't make the tackle, then they are responsible for making a tackle. So I want you to think about these lines of defenses as the defense on a football field. You got the first line, you have the second line, and you have the third line. And of course, those of you who are football fans know that sometimes running backs are fast enough and quick enough and elusive enough that they can score a touchdown, right? However, in a financial institution, if that first line and that second line and that third line, fill in the gaps and complement each other, then there should be no touchdowns given up from the 50-yard line, right? I mean, there are going to be some losses in any organization, but we don't want to give up the big loss. Now, this slide is a summary of some extra value added in this particular chapter that we've kind of danced around in the previous chapters, but this is a good one to probably know. And this is one of those common sense kinds of slides, motivations to do this. All right, to build trust and reputation. All right, we can live with that, regain public trust, but I want to come back and talk about that here in just a second. Let's skip ahead the second one and look at this third one here. What's the goal of the business? Maximize shareholder wealth. Of course, we know that. One of the ways that financial institutions do this is to, of course, beat the other bank to whatever that market share is. Look at this fourth one here. Of course, how do we maximize shareholder wealth? Well, we hire people who are way smarter than we are. I mean, I tell my children this all the time. I tell my students that the greatest decision that I ever made in my life was 30 years ago. I married my wife, who is smarter than I am. She's funnier than I am. She's better looking than I am. She's not more athletic than I am. But anyway, so what? So my wife has brought me up and has helped bring my children up. And of course, that has lots and lots of positive consequences. And so I love love that fourth one there, to encourage new talent to join the industry. You don't want to have this, one of the 7 deadly sins of envy. You don't want to envy. You want those smart people to come to be on your team so that they can leapfrog you to maximizing shareholder wealth, which will then, of course, come in the form of higher compensation and benefits to all of the individuals inside of that firm. And of course, that fifth one there, we always have to talk about regulators and government officials that, lots and lots of politicians are saying, greedy Wall Street, greedy Wall Street. And so a lot of individuals hear that. And so it's our job to push back on that. Yes, we're trying to maximize shareholder wealth, but we're doing it in a system in which the culture is benefiting everybody. Now, let's go ahead and skip back to that second one up there, to stabilize the broader financial system. Boy, this is a goal that I'm not quite sure that that we can have that as one of those specific goals. That sounds like one of those, kind of general goals, like, to benefit all people in the world. But what I want to do is emphasize this. You can go back, what is it now, 240 years or so, to that dude, Adam Smith, who talked about the invisible hand. My point here is that invisible hand in the Adam Smith economics, in the 1760s and 1780s, was that if each individual acts in their own self-interest, to bring their self-interest to some kind of a trade, then everyone's going to be better off, because the price that results from that trade is going to be fair. Right? The only way 2 greedy people can trade is if they have a fair price. And so that's part of this motivation, is the Adam Smith invisible hand, that if we do, if we do 1 and 3 and 4 and 5, if we do all of those effectively, if those clients come into our financial institution and then they leave with smiles on their faces, then that goal will be achieved. Now, of course, nothing is easy, and there are all sorts of challenges, culture and conduct fatigue. All right, so I experience this where I teach. I don't know if I would call it fatigue, but I would call it something like, less than enthusiasm. And so, you get these things and you're thinking, okay. But my point in a previous video was that the way to attack culture and conduct fatigue is to make it part of each individual and each team's DNA. Another challenge is that, of course, when you think of a financial institution, you think of a lot of really smart men and women with their HP 12C calculators out, just punching away and punching away and punching away and doing lots of numbers. And so, of course, financial managers have tremendous quantitative skills, but this conduct and culture shifts away from the quantitative into the qualitative. Some behavioral issues. A lot of people call these soft skills. And so this is the job of the board of directors, to emphasize how important these qualitative items are. And in fact, the board should hire and fire those qualitatively skilled managers who meet or don't meet the conduct and the culture of the financial institution. And then, of course, the last one there has everything to do with hiring highly skilled leaders. Now, I've seen this, and I'm sure you guys have seen this. There are just some individuals who are natural leaders. And I have had multiple leaders where, in the institutions where I have taught, where I have thought to myself, boy, this man or this woman, they know what they're doing. When they talk, I'm going to listen and I'm going to learn. And then, of course, there are others who just get up and talk and talk and talk. And you're thinking, what am I doing here? So what's that third one say? More refined and effective management style. What that means then is finding individuals who are highly skilled leaders so that they can form a team and have these team members buy into the conduct and culture movement. Now, conduct in the retail banking industry might not be the same as conduct in the ultra high net worth portfolio management industry. And so there are going to be new and challenging areas inside of each of those. Can I call those a silo or a business line? And so this is why you need these business unit managers to be excellent leaders, so they can provide guidelines for new areas. Rolling bad apples, boy, look at this one here. Poor conduct records freely move from one bank to another. All right, I have a lot to say about this, but I won't. When I've interviewed people over the years, whether it's for a teaching position or some of the other committees that I have served on in the not-for-profits in the area, when I interview someone, the first thing that I do is I look at the references and I say, well, let me see what these people have to say about the individual and the candidate. And so, yes, let's pick up the phone and call and let's see what they have to say, because, a letter of recommendation, I've never read a letter of recommendation that says, Dear Jim, this person who's applying for this job really stinks. I've never read one of those. So you can't really read between the lines and among all the lines in a letter of recommendation. And so this is what my suggestion here is that, if we're in the hiring process, it should be relatively easy to identify, boy, what do I have there? Individuals with poor conduct records. And then this idea of conduct arbitrage, they might be able to get away with poor conduct if the business line managers or the supervisors are not consistent in their application of the guidelines and what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. All right, let's go ahead and talk about some recommendations. So this is referencing back to a 2015 report by the G30 Working Group, which is actually the author of this particular chapter. Actually, if you go to the G30 Working Group webpage today, I think there are actually 32 in the G30, but I'm not 100% on that. Who cares what the number is? But these are really, really smart men and women who are trying to figure out what is important for the financial institution industry today, and how does that reflect into more and more behavioral conduct as it moves into the future. All right, so I think there are 6 of these recommendations. All right, fundamental shift in the overall mindset on culture. Of course, that makes perfect sense based on all the stuff that we've been talking about. Senior accountability and governance. So starts with the board and then goes to the senior executive team. Performance management and incentive. All right, so this goes to, of course, you have to have contracts that outline acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. And part of that contract means that you need to compensate individuals who are going to abide by these new guidelines and, in fact, promote the financial institution into the whole goal of maximizing shareholder wealth. Staff development and promotion. Of course, this makes perfect sense. So you promote and you develop teams based on their ability to continue on this idea of promoting appropriate bank conduct and bank culture. And then remember a few slides ago, I said I had a slide about these 3 lines of defense. So, all right, so what we have? We're the football team, our first line of defense, staff and management in that particular business line. All right. Second line of defense should go to, the risk management officers. And then the third line of defense is some kind of an audit function. All right. So you think about that. You got the linemen, you have the linebackers, and you have the secondary on a football field. And here we have these lines of defenses. So imagine this. Are we going to experience heavy losses because of some mismanagement of operational risk if we have excellent first and second and third lines of defense? And I hope the answer to that question is probably no. And then, of course, you've got regulators and supervisors and government authorities who are kind of hanging around watching what goes on. How much progress has been made? Boy, this is one of those areas where, I think about this as a parent. My children, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, whether it's in athletics or academics or socially. And so this is probably what probably a good answer for this particular question. And then, of course, the next slide is one of those, okay, the bank can make 2 or 3 steps back, but then we have these high profile cases where we're taking 2 or 5 or 10 steps back. 10 steps backwards. I will make one comment about Wells Fargo. My father, who is no longer with us, but in 2016, he was a Wells Fargo client, and he was one of those clients who was very interested in the bank, making sure that they were taking care of all of his money. Not that it was millions of dollars, but to him it was substantial. And when this scandal broke, my father, who was a good watcher of business news every night, as came on Wells Fargo, he got on the phone and he goes, "I sure hope you're not doing any of this stuff with my account." So, can I go back to this slide here? Where was that? Look at the bottom one there. Regulators, supervisors, and enforcement authorities. Well, my dad was none of those. Yet, when this scandal occurred, he was part of a line of defense. He was like the safety who was way in the back. Of course, in 2016, my dad was, how old was he? He was 79 or so. So he wasn't tackling anybody on a football field, but he was able to tackle and make certain that those Wells Fargo employees were aware that he knew what was going on. And by golly, they better not be they better not be fooling around with his accounts. Here's a slide that's taken from this CSI webpage. And what it does is what these people do is they have established a fairly unique and customizable scorecard for measuring performance. And there's the link there. You can go to this webpage, which I have done multiple times. And this is just one example of a monthly evaluation of whether or not a particular financial manager was meeting a specific goal. So look on the top up there, it's an objective. And so these objectives could be anything. They could be something as specific as when somebody comes in to borrow $1 million, we lend them $1 million. Now, of course, that's a silly one, but it could be that specific. Or it could be general, saying when someone comes in with $1 million, they leave with a smile on their face. So some of these can be quantitatively measured, but some of these, may not be. How about a quick slide just on training programs? We've talked at length about the need for communication and education. And so training, it's quite a challenge. I mean, do you or do we want to take time off this afternoon, let's say from 2 to 3 o'clock from our busy schedule, and sit in front of our computer or go to a meeting room or have some kind of a Zoom conference call and listen to an individual talk for an hour about some particular topic? And the answer is, probably not, unless it's engaging and all that kind of stuff. So these training programs have to be done by professionals, whether they're done internally or outsourced to some external organization. Look at that last block point down there. I chuckled when I read about this, investing in surveillance technology. Now, as a good parent who tries to make my children read, when they were 7th and 8th grade, I made them read Animal Farm. And then when they got older, I said, you guys need to read 1984. And they were like, Dad, look at that book. It's too long. We know all about 1984, where, there's Big Brother out there keeping track of all our stuff. So, there are benefits and there are challenges, and then there are consequences to surveillance technology. But this goes back to what I've said in some previous visits that we've had with each other. One of the things I try to teach my children is integrity, right? They make decisions as if mom or dad were standing right over your shoulder. And, this surveillance technology is having mom or dad stand right over your shoulder at all times. Now, the next learning objective asks the question regarding viewpoints from different countries' standpoint on culture and conduct. And so what we've done here in these series of, I think it's 3 slides, is make some bolded phrases for each individual country. So none of this is really new, but what I would do if I were you guys is I would, try to memorize these bolded words for each particular country. If I read these for the UK, raise standards, promote forward-looking conduct, individual accountability. All right, so if you can remember those for the UK, that's probably, I would think that would be sufficient to answer a question if a question asked you about, different countries' attitudes. And then Japan, intention to shift focus on firms' governance and cultures. Senior management, auditors. And so, you just look at the difference between those two. Individual accountability in UK, senior management in Japan. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Hong Kong, accountability of senior management, supervisory measures for bank culture. I mean, this is interesting in Hong Kong to have some kind of a measure that can be placed, at or near the top. And so, of course, if all of the team members can view this at the top, then hopefully they would follow suit. Boy, look at the United States. What do we have here in the United States? We have lots of politicians who like to say, you know what, we know what's best for everybody out there. So look at all these things that we have. So we got all these different kinds of organizations that have pressured financial institutions to focus on culture and conduct. Canada, require bank employees' obligation to obtain customer consent, fees and costs, domestic retail sales practices, and then Australia, accountability, et cetera, et cetera. Here we go, best practices. So this is always a good idea. Of all the stuff that's out there, what's going to best provide us with an opportunity to satisfy everything that we've talked about in this particular slide deck and in previous slide decks. All right, so look at that first one there. Management should be a continuous effort of culture and of conduct. Look at that. Culture is not static. So this is a dynamic environment. Leadership always matters. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. I've said to you guys in the previous videos that part of my dissertation was on board of director composition and leadership. And so I looked at about 2,000 different corporate boards, and you find some that are really good and you find some that are lacking. So leadership always matters. That's important. Look at the third one. The scope of conduct management is changing from misconduct to conduct risk management. So the focus is not trying to find individuals out there who are doing something that they shouldn't be doing, but rather educating and providing leadership so that individuals, when they're faced with that decision, that they don't make that decision to perform poorly or to make unethical decisions. Cultural norms and beliefs cannot be explicitly measured. Of course they cannot, but it's like, what do people say about art? People say, you know what, I don't know anything about art, but I like looking at that piece. I don't know anything about art, but that thing is ugly. Same thing here. So read that last one down there. Restoration of trust will benefit the entire industry as a whole. Of course, these behaviors, if they start down here from let's suppose we're talking about a bank teller all the way up to the chief executive officer, if this system of culture and conduct is consistently applied all the way through, then what does it say on that bottom one? Restoration of trust. Boy, doesn't it stink that it appears as if the consuming public maybe has not lost trust in the financial services industry, but doesn't have as much trust as it should. I mean, let's face it, what do we do in the financial services industry? We help people achieve their financial goals. They should trust us more than anybody. And I think that takes us through the learning objectives. It's probably hard to identify which of those 5 is most important, but look at the title of the chapter, Conduct and Culture, and so I would know everything about that.